Story 1. I've spent most of my adult life studying weather patterns in some of the most inhospitable places on Earth. I've weathered hurricanes in the Gulf, tracked tornadoes across the American plains, and measured ice thickness in Antarctic stations so remote that rescue was never guaranteed. But nothing prepared me for what I experienced during my rotation at Outpost Vostok 7 inches Central Siberia during the polar night of 2019. The job posting had seemed straightforward enough. The Russian Meteorological Service needed experienced observers willing to spend 3 months at an automated weather station that required human oversight during the critical winter data collection period. The pay was exceptional precisely because no one wanted the assignment. 63 days of complete darkness, temperatures that regularly drop below -50°C. The nearest human settlement was a mining outpost nearly 300 kilometers to the south, and even that was barely more than a handful of prefabricated buildings clinging to existence in the frozen wasteland. I arrived at the outpost in late October, just as the last sliver of sun was disappearing below the horizon for the final time until January. The helicopter pilot who dropped me off was a grizzled veteran of Arctic supply runs, and even he seemed uneasy as he helped me unload my personal gear. He kept glancing toward the northern horizon, toward the endless expanse of frozen tundra that stretched into absolute nothing. When I asked him what was wrong, he just shook his head and told me to keep my radio charged. Then he was gone, the sound of his rotors fading into the perpetual twilight until I was left with nothing but the wind and the growing darkness. The outpost itself was small but well equipped. A central living quarters connected to a separate instrument building by an enclosed walkway. Backup generators, enough food and fuel to last 6 months if necessary. Satellite communication equipment that linked me to the main station in Yakutsk every 12 hours for data transmission and welfare checks. The previous observer had left detailed notes about the daily routines, the equipment quirks, the best ways to maintain sanity during the long dark. He had mentioned the isolation, the strange tricks the darkness played on the mind, the importance of maintaining a strict schedule. What he hadn't mentioned was anything that should have prepared me for the 42nd night. The first few weeks passed in a rhythm that became almost meditative. I would wake at what my watch told me was morning, though the sky outside remained an unchanging black void. I would check the instruments, record the data, perform maintenance on the equipment. I would eat my meals at regular intervals, exercise in the small space I had cleared in the storage room, read from the library of books previous observers had accumulated over the years. I would radio Yakutsk with my daily reports, exchange a few words with whoever was on duty, then sign off and return to my solitary routine. The darkness was oppressive, certainly, but I had expected that. What I hadn't expected was how alive the darkness would eventually feel. It started with sounds, small things at first, the creak of metal contracting in the extreme cold, the whistle of wind finding gaps in the insulation I hadn't noticed, the occasional groan of ice shifting somewhere in the distance. All explainable, all normal. But around day 30, the sounds began to change. I would hear what sounded like footsteps on the roof, heavy and deliberate, though when I checked the external cameras, there was nothing but empty snow. I would hear tapping on the windows, rhythmic and insistent, though the wind was calm and nothing showed on the motion sensors. I told myself it was the isolation affecting my perception. I told myself the brain creates patterns where none exist when deprived of sensory input for too long. I almost believed it. Then came the 42nd night, and believing became impossible. I was in the instrument room, recording temperature readings from the external sensors, when I noticed something through the small window that faced north. A light. Faint at first. So faint, I thought my eyes were playing tricks after weeks of straining against the darkness. But it grew brighter, more defined, until there was no denying its presence. A soft, pulsing glow, hovering perhaps 2 kilometers across the frozen tundra. It moved slowly, drifting left and right in a pattern that seemed almost purposeful, like a searchlight sweeping across a field. My first thought was Aurora Borealis, but I had seen the northern lights many times during my career, and this was nothing like them. The color was wrong, a pale, sickly yellow rather than the greens and purples of ionized particles. The movement was wrong, deliberate, and controlled rather than flowing and organic. And most disturbingly, my magnetometer showed no fluctuations whatsoever. Whatever was producing that light, it wasn't any natural phenomenon I had ever documented. I retrieved my binoculars and watched the glow for nearly 3 hours. It never came closer to the outpost, but it never retreated either. It simply drifted across the tundra, pulsing in a rhythm that was almost like breathing. Sometimes it would pause, hovering in place for several minutes, as if it was examining something on the ground. Other times it would move in circles, tight spirals that reminded me uncomfortably of a predator tracking wounded prey. Around midnight, though, the concept of midnight had lost all meaning in the perpetual darkness. I decided to report what I was seeing to the main station. I went to the radio room and powered up the equipment, but the moment I reached for the transmitter, static erupted from the speakers. Not normal interference. This was different. Beneath the hiss and crackle, I could hear something else. A sound that made my blood run cold despite the layers of thermal clothing I wore. Breathing. Slow, deliberate, wet breathing, as if someone was pressing their mouth directly against a microphone somewhere in the frozen void. I adjusted the frequency, thinking I had somehow picked up a stray signal from another station, but the breathing followed. Every frequency I tried, the same sound. Inhale, exhale, patient and measured, like something that had all the time in the world. I turned off the radio. The breathing stopped. I sat in the darkness of the radio room for a long time, my hands shaking, telling myself there had to be an explanation. Equipment malfunction, signal bounce from some distant transmission tower. Anything but what my instincts were screaming. When I finally returned to the window, the light was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the main room with every interior light blazing, watching the external camera feeds and waiting for morning. But morning in polar night is just a word. The darkness remained absolute, broken only by the pale glow of my instrument panels and the harsh fluorescent tubes overhead. The next day I still called them days, clinging to the structure of a schedule that no longer had any connection to the natural world. I went outside to check the weather sensors. The temperature had dropped during the night, and I needed to clear ice from some of the measurement equipment. I bundled into my survival suit, activated my headlamp, and stepped through the airlock into the frozen darkness. The cold hit me like a physical force, stealing the breath from my lungs despite the thermal mask covering my face. I had experienced extreme temperatures before, but something about that particular morning felt different. Heavier, more malevolent, as if the darkness itself was pressing against me, testing my resolve. I made my way around the outpost, checking each sensor in turn, my headlamp carving a small tunnel of visibility through the black void. The snow crunched beneath my boots, the only sound in a world that had gone completely silent. No wind, no distant animal calls, nothing but my own labored breathing and the creak of my suit as I moved. I was heading back toward the airlock when I saw the footprints. They emerged from the northern darkness, a single line of tracks leading directly toward the outpost, human-shaped, roughly human-sized, pressed into the snow with a clarity that suggested they were recent, very recent. I followed them with my headlamp, my heart pounding against my ribs, and watched as they circled the building. Around and around, 17 complete circuits, each footprint placed with deliberate precision. Then they simply stopped, no trail leading away, no indication of where the walker had gone. The footprints ended in the middle of an unmarked expanse of snow, as if whoever made them had simply ceased to exist. I knelt beside one of the prints, examining it more closely. The shape was wrong. The stride was too long, nearly twice what a normal human gait would produce, and the impressions themselves were strange, shallow, too shallow for someone walking on snow in these temperatures, as if whatever made them weighed almost nothing at all. I went back inside and locked the airlock behind me. I checked every window, every door, every possible point of entry. I reviewed the camera footage from the night before, searching for any sign of movement. The cameras had captured nothing, just darkness and snow and the occasional swirl of wind-blown ice crystals. No figure walking around the outpost. No explanation for the footprints that now surrounded my only shelter for hundreds of kilometers. I radioed Yakutsk and reported what I had found. The operator on duty listened patiently, then told me that isolation sickness could produce vivid hallucinations. He recommended I increase my vitamin D supplements and try to maintain a regular sleep schedule. When I insisted that I wasn't hallucinating, that I had photographs of the footprints, he promised to forward my concerns to the station supervisor. I never heard back. That night, I turned off every light in the outpost. I'm not sure why I did it. Instinct, maybe. some primal part of my brain that understood something my conscious mind refused to accept. The glow had been searching, looking, and I had been the only source of artificial light for hundreds of kilometers, a beacon in the absolute darkness, announcing my presence to whatever was out there. I sat in the dark for 21 days. I ate my meals by the faint glow of a single candle, shielded from the windows. I read by the light of a small flashlight held under a blanket. I conducted my observations and recorded my data using the minimum illumination necessary, always keeping the curtains drawn, always staying away from the glass. I saw the light 3 more times during those 21 nights. Each time it was closer. Each time it lingered longer, drifting back and forth across the tundra, as if frustrated by something it could no longer find. Each time I held my breath, pressed against the interior wall, praying to whatever God might exist in that frozen hell, that the darkness inside would hide me from the darkness outside. The footprints appeared twice more, always in the night, always circling the outpost, always ending in nothing. I stopped going outside to check the sensors. I stopped doing anything that might require me to leave the safety of those walls. When the helicopter finally arrived on day 63, bringing my replacement and the promise of escape, I nearly wept with relief. The pilot asked me why I looked so pale, so thin, so haunted. I told him the isolation had been difficult. I didn't tell him about the light. I didn't tell him about the footprints. I didn't tell him about the breathing on the radio that I still heard sometimes in my nightmares. My replacement was a young researcher from Moscow, eager and enthusiastic about his first polar assignment. As I boarded the helicopter, he asked me if I had any advice for surviving the long dark. I looked at him, at his bright eyes and his confident smile, and I told him to keep his lights off at night. He laughed, thinking I was joking. I wasn't. Sometimes, when I'm lying awake in my apartment in St. Petersburg, surrounded by the comfortable glow of city lights, I wonder if he understood eventually. I wonder if he saw what I saw, felt what I felt, heard the breathing on the radio in the depths of polar night. I wonder if he's still there, still hiding in the darkness, waiting for the sun to return. Or I wonder if the light finally found what it was looking for. Story 2. My brother Victor and I learned to fish before we learned to read. Our father took us onto the frozen lakes of the Sakha Republic when we were barely old enough to walk, teaching us how to read the ice, how to find the spots where fish gathered in the dark waters below, how to survive in temperatures that would kill an unprepared man in minutes. By the time we were adults, fishing was as natural to us as breathing. We knew every lake within 100 kilometers of our village. We knew their moods, their dangers, their secrets. Or so we thought. Lake Kolonoy sat about 60 kilometers north of our village, accessible only by snowmobile during the winter months. The name meant Cold Lake in Russian, though the local Yakut people had an older name for it that roughly translated to the lake that listens. We never paid much attention to the old stories. Every lake in Siberia had legends attached to it, spirits that lived in the water, creatures that pulled fishermen through the ice, tales meant to frighten children and entertain tourists. Victor and I were practical men. We believed in what we could see, what we could touch, what we could sell at the market in Yakutsk. We had fished Kolodnoy for 15 years without incident. The polar night never bothered us. When you grow up in a place where the sun disappears for 2 months every winter, you learn to find comfort in the darkness. It becomes familiar, almost friendly. The isolation was part of the appeal. No competition from other fishermen, no sounds except the wind and the occasional crack of shifting ice. Just Victor and me, doing what our father had taught us, maintaining a tradition that stretched back generations. Then came the winter of 2021, and everything we thought we knew about that lake proved to be wrong. We arrived at our usual spot in early December, just as the polar night was settling into its deepest phase. The ice was thick and solid, nearly a meter deep according to our measurements. Perfect conditions. We set up our small heated tent on the shore, unpacked our equipment, and prepared for a week of fishing. The first 2 days passed without anything unusual. We cut our holes, set our lines, pulled up enough fish to justify the trip. Victor was in good spirits, talking about his wife Anya and their plans to visit her family in Irkutsk for the new year. I listened and nodded, thinking about my own daughter Masha and how quickly she was growing up. On the third night, everything changed. We were sitting by one of the fishing holes, watching our lines in the glow of a small lantern, when Victor suddenly went still. His face, already pale from the cold, turned the color of fresh snow. He held up his hand for silence, tilting his head toward the ice beneath our feet. I asked him what was wrong, keeping my voice low. He didn't answer. He just pointed down at the fishing hole, at the dark water visible through the gap we had cut. I leaned closer, thinking maybe he had spotted a large fish approaching, something worth getting excited about. But when I listened, I understood why he looked so frightened. Voices, coming from beneath the ice. Not muffled or distorted the way sound travels through water. Clear voices, multiple speakers, talking over each other in a dialect I didn't recognize, but somehow understood fragments of. They were asking for help, pleading, almost, saying that they were cold, that they were lost, that they had been down there for so long. I pulled back from the hole, my heart hammering against my ribs. Victor grabbed my arm and whispered that we needed to cut the ice wider. Someone had fallen through somewhere upstream, he said. The current had carried them beneath the frozen surface. They were trapped under there, somehow still alive, and we needed to get them out. I told him that was impossible. The ice was nearly a meter thick. No one could survive beneath it. The water temperature was barely above freezing. Even if someone had fallen through, they would have been dead within minutes. There was no current strong enough to carry a body this far. What we were hearing couldn't be real. But Victor wasn't listening. He was already reaching for the ice saw, his eyes fixed on the fishing hole with an intensity I had never seen before. The voices continued, clearer now, more insistent. They knew we were there. They were calling to us specifically. Then they said Victor's name. He froze with the saw in his hands. The voice from beneath the ice spoke his name again, then mine. It described our village, our house, the fishing boat our father had built before he died. Details no stranger could possibly know. Details that made no sense coming from beneath a frozen lake in the middle of nowhere. I wanted to run. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to get away from that hole, to get off the ice, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was speaking from the dark water below. But I couldn't move. The voices held me there, frozen in place, as they began to speak about our mother. She had died 3 years before, cancer. We had buried her in the small cemetery behind the village church, in a plot next to our father. The funeral had been small, just family and a few close friends. Victor and I had carried her casket together. We had stood by her grave as the priest said the final prayers. We had thrown handfuls of frozen earth onto the wooden lid as it was lowered into the ground. The voices described all of it, every detail. The color of the flowers on her casket, the crack in Victor's voice when he tried to speak, the way I had gripped the cemetery fence so hard my knuckles turned white. Things no one could have known unless they had been there. Things no one could have remembered so perfectly unless they had lived through them. Victor dropped the ice saw. Tears were streaming down his face, freezing on his cheeks before they could fall. He whispered our mother's name, asking if she was down there, asking if she needed help. The voices didn't answer directly. Instead, they changed. The tone shifted from pleading to something else, something that sounded almost like satisfaction. They began describing things that hadn't happened yet. Victor's wife, Anya, would leave him in the spring, they said. She would take their son and move to her mother's apartment in Irkutsk. Victor would spend 6 months trying to win her back before finally accepting that the marriage was over. My daughter, Masha, would get sick in the autumn, something in her lungs. The doctors would catch it late because we couldn't afford the expensive tests. She would spend 3 weeks in the hospital in Yakutsk before recovering, but the medical bills would force me to sell our father's fishing boat. We listened in horror as the voices laid out our futures with terrible precision. They spoke matter-of-factly, without emotion, as if they were reading from a script that had already been written. When they finished, they fell silent. The only sound was the wind howling across the frozen surface of the lake and Victor's ragged breathing beside me. We packed our equipment in the dark. We didn't speak. We didn't look at the fishing holes as we passed them. We just loaded everything onto the snowmobiles and drove south through the polar night, not stopping until we reached the outskirts of our village. I don't remember the journey. My mind was somewhere else, replaying the voices over and over, trying to convince myself that what we had heard was some kind of trick, some bizarre acoustic phenomenon with a rational explanation. We never spoke about that night, not to each other, not to anyone else. We never returned to Lake Kolodnoy. We found other lakes, other fishing grounds, places without old names and older legends. For a few months, I managed to convince myself that we had imagined the whole thing. Isolation and darkness, playing tricks on our minds. The kind of story that would make people laugh if we ever told it. Then spring came, and Anya left Victor. She didn't explain why. She just packed her bags one morning, took their son, and drove to Irkutsk. Victor called me that night, his voice hollow and broken, and asked me if I remembered what the voices had said. I told him it was a coincidence. Marriages fell apart all the time. It didn't mean anything. But we both knew I was lying. That autumn, Masha developed a persistent cough. The village doctor thought it was just a cold, but it didn't go away. By October, she was having trouble breathing. We drove her to Yakutsk, where the specialists ran test after test, apologizing for not catching it sooner. 3 weeks in the hospital, expensive medications, a slow recovery that left her weak for months afterward. I sold our father's boat to pay the bills, just as the voices had predicted. Victor stopped calling after that. I heard through village gossip that he had started drinking heavily, that he barely left his house, that he sat by his window at night, staring out at the darkness. I wanted to help him, but I didn't know how. What do you say to someone who has heard his own future spoken by voices beneath the ice? What comfort can you offer when you've heard your own fate laid out with equal precision? The polar night returned that December, and with it came the voices. Not from the lake this time, from somewhere much closer. The first time I heard them, I was lying in bed, trying to sleep despite the perpetual darkness outside my window. A whisper, barely audible, coming from the wall beside my head. I pressed my ear against the plaster and listened. The same voices, the same dialect I couldn't quite identify. They were asking for help again, but their tone had changed. There was something else mixed in with the pleading now, something that sounded like laughter. I tore apart that wall the next morning, convinced I would find some explanation. Pipes carrying sound from a neighbor's house, animals nesting in the insulation, anything rational. But there was nothing behind the plaster except wooden beams and empty space. No source for the voices that I heard again that night, and the night after, and every night since. They don't just ask for help anymore. They describe things that are going to happen. Small things at first. A broken window, a dead car battery, a letter from an old friend I hadn't heard from in years. Each prediction comes true within days, exactly as they described. Each confirmation makes me more certain that the voices are real, that whatever we encountered beneath the ice at Lake Kolodnoy has followed us home. Victor died last winter. They found him on the shore of a small lake near the village, frozen solid, his hands bloody from trying to claw through ice that was 30 centimeters thick. The official cause of death was hypothermia and psychological disturbance. But I know the truth. I know what he was trying to reach. I know what he was trying to find beneath that ice. What he was hoping would finally answer his questions about how and why. I still hear the voices every night. They're louder now, clearer, as if they're getting closer to the surface. They've started describing things further in the future. My daughter's wedding, my grandson's birth, my own death, which they tell me will come in the winter of 2029, alone in this house, while the polar darkness presses against the windows. Sometimes they still ask for help. Their pleading sounds almost genuine, almost human. But I've learned to listen for what comes after. The soft laughter that echoes through the walls when they think I'm not paying attention. The satisfaction in their voices when another prediction comes true. I don't know what's beneath the ice at Lake Kolodnoy. I don't know what followed Victor and me back to the village, or why it chose us, or what it wants. All I know is that some nights, when the polar darkness is at its deepest, I can hear scratching behind the walls, like something is trying to get out, or maybe trying to get in. Story 3. The production company that hired us specialized in documentaries about abandoned places. Urban exploration content was popular in 2019, and someone had pitched the idea of filming Soviet-era ghost towns in Siberia during polar night. The concept was compelling. Entire communities frozen in time, preserved by the extreme cold, captured in the perpetual darkness of Arctic winter. It would be atmospheric, haunting, unlike anything audiences had seen before. I signed on as the sound engineer, eager for an adventure that would look impressive on my resume. Our crew consisted of 5 people. Dmitry was our director, a chain-smoking Muscovite with an obsessive attention to detail and a reputation for pushing his teams to their limits. Elena handled camera work, a quiet woman from St. Petersburg who had filmed everything from war zones to wildlife migrations. Sergei was our local guide, born and raised in Yakutsk, fluent in the landscape and the dangers it presented. Yuri drove the expedition vehicle and handled logistics. And then there was me, Alexei, 28 years old, convinced I was prepared for anything. We spent 3 weeks documenting abandoned settlements throughout the Sakha Republic. Collective farms where the tractors still sat in their sheds, rusting slowly in the dry cold. Mining towns where the equipment remained exactly where workers had left it when the funding disappeared. Small villages where family photographs still hung on walls, where dishes still sat in cupboards, where children's drawings were still pinned to refrigerators. Each location was eerie in its own way, but also strangely peaceful. These were places where history had simply stopped, preserved like insects in amber, waiting for someone to remember them. Then Sergei told us about Kolodny. He mentioned it almost casually one evening as we reviewed our shooting schedule. There was a village about 200 kilometers northwest of our current position, he said. Abandoned in 1987, population 847, official reason for evacuation listed only as relocation. No further documentation existed in any archive he had accessed. No photographs, no personal accounts, no explanation for why nearly 1,000 people had left their homes and never spoken about it publicly. Dmitry was immediately interested. A mystery was exactly what the documentary needed. Something to elevate it beyond simple exploration footage, to give it a narrative hook that would attract viewers. He asked Sergei if he could get us there, and Sergei hesitated in a way I had never seen from him before. He said yes, eventually, but warned us that the locals in the nearest inhabited settlement refused to discuss Kolodny. When he had asked about it during his research, people had changed the subject or simply walked away. One old woman had made the sign of the cross and told him that some places should stay forgotten. We should have listened. We should have recognized that hesitation for what it was. But Dmitry was already planning shots, already envisioning how he would frame the mystery, already convinced that Kolodny would be the centerpiece of our documentary. 2 days later, we loaded our equipment into the expedition vehicle and drove northwest into the frozen darkness. We arrived at Kolodny during the deepest part of polar night, when the sun hadn't risen above the horizon for nearly a month and wouldn't for another 3 weeks. Our headlights cut through absolute blackness as we approached the village, revealing glimpses of structures emerging from the snow like bones from frozen earth. Sergei stopped the vehicle at the edge of what had once been the main road, and we sat in silence for a long moment, staring at what our lights revealed. The buildings were in remarkable condition, not the slow decay we had documented in other abandoned settlements, where roofs sagged and walls buckled, and nature gradually reclaimed what humans had built. These structures looked almost maintained, windows intact, doors properly closed, snow cleared from walkways as if someone had shoveled recently, though our tracks were the first to mark the pristine white surface. We set up base camp in what had been the village administrative building, a 2-story structure at the center of the settlement. The interior was as preserved as the exterior, furniture arranged as if people had just stepped out for a moment, documents stacked neatly on desks, a calendar on the wall still showing October 1987, the month of the evacuation. Everything was covered in a fine layer of ice crystals that sparkled in our flashlight beams like scattered diamonds, beautiful and deeply unsettling. Elena began filming immediately, capturing the eerie perfection of the abandoned offices. I set up my recording equipment, testing the acoustics, noting how the cold affected the sensitivity of my microphones. The silence was profound, almost physical in its weight. No wind penetrated the walls. No animals stirred in the darkness outside, just the sound of our own breathing and the creak of our boots on frozen floorboards. The first day of filming went smoothly. We documented the administrative building, the general store, several residential homes. Each location revealed the same pattern: lives interrupted mid-motion, meals left on tables, now frozen solid, clothes laid out on beds as if someone had been preparing to dress, children's toys scattered across bedroom floors, waiting for small hands that never returned. I recorded ambient sound in each location, capturing the subtle groans of settling wood and the whisper of frost forming on glass. That night, we slept in shifts, keeping the generator running to power our equipment and provide minimal heat. The temperature outside had dropped below -40 Celsius, and even inside the building, Our breath formed clouds that froze on contact with any surface. I took the midnight watch, sitting by the window with a thermos of tea, staring out at the absolute darkness that surrounded us. I couldn't see the other buildings, couldn't see anything beyond the faint reflection of our lights on the nearby snow. It was as if Kolodny existed in a void, separated from the rest of the world by walls of impenetrable black. The second night is when everything changed. We had spent the day filming the schoolhouse, a long building on the eastern edge of the village that contained classrooms for children of all ages. The desks were still arranged in neat rows. Textbooks lay open to lessons that would never be completed. A chalkboard at the front of one room still showed a partially erased mathematics problem, the teacher's handwriting preserved for 36 years. Elena captured everything with her usual precision while I recorded the sound of wind beginning to pick up outside, a low moan that seemed to circle the building without ever quite reaching it. We returned to our base camp as the darkness deepened, if such a thing was possible. Dmitri wanted to review the footage we had captured to plan our final day of shooting before we departed. We gathered around the monitors, watching Elena's careful documentation of the frozen village, when Sergei suddenly stood up and walked to the window. He said something was wrong. The lights were on. I didn't understand at first. Our generator was running, providing power to our equipment. Of course, lights were on. But then I followed his gaze out the window, and my blood turned as cold as the air outside. Across the village, in every building we could see, lights were glowing in the windows. Electric lights, warm yellow illumination spilling out onto the snow, turning the darkness into something that almost resembled a living community. Electricity that hadn't flowed through those lines in 36 years was suddenly humming to life, powering bulbs that should have burned out decades ago, filling Kolodny with the appearance of habitation. Elena grabbed her camera. Dmitri was already moving toward the door, driven by some combination of professional instinct and dangerous curiosity. Sergei caught his arm and told him to wait. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. We needed to stay inside, to stay quiet, to wait and see what happened next. Then we heard the doors opening. Not one door, dozens of them, all at once. Throughout the village, the sound of doors swinging open on hinges that should have been frozen solid. The noise echoed through the polar night, a chorus of creaking wood and groaning metal that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Footsteps followed, the crunch of boots on frozen ground, multiplied by what sounded like dozens of walkers. Heavy steps, purposeful steps, the sound of people moving through the village with the casual confidence of residents who knew exactly where they were going. Voices accompanied the footsteps. Conversations in hushed Russian, fragments of sentences carried on the still air. Someone discussing the price of bread, someone complaining about the cold, someone calling a name that might have been a child's. I pressed my face to the window, straining to see who was making those sounds. The lights illuminated the streets clearly now, casting long shadows across the snow. But the streets were empty. Every building glowed with warmth and life. Sounds of activity poured from every direction, but not a single person was visible anywhere. Then I heard the laughter. It came from the schoolhouse we had filmed earlier that day. A child's laughter, bright and innocent, the sound of genuine joy that should have been comforting but instead sent ice through my veins. It was followed by more laughter, multiple children, playing some game in classrooms that had been abandoned for 36 years. I heard them running, their footsteps echoing through the halls, their voices calling out to each other in Russian. Dmitri finally pushed past Sergei and threw open the door. He stepped outside, camera in hand, ready to document whatever impossible thing was happening in Kolodny. I followed him, unable to resist the pull of that terrible curiosity. Elena was behind me, her own camera recording, her hands shaking visibly despite her years of experience in difficult conditions. The cold hit us immediately, brutal and absolute, but we barely noticed. We were too focused on what we heard. All around us, the village had come alive. Conversations floated from open doorways, dishes clinked in kitchens. Music played from a radio somewhere, a Soviet-era song from the 1980 seconds. The sounds of 847 people living their lives surrounded us completely, but we couldn't see a single one of them. Dmitri approached the nearest house, the one directly across from our base camp. The lights were on inside, warm and inviting. Through the window, we could see the interior clearly, the same preserved furniture, the same frozen meals on tables, the same layer of ice crystals coating every surface. But we could also hear voices from inside, a man and woman discussing something about their daughter's schoolwork, the clatter of utensils, the scrape of chairs on wooden floors. He pushed open the door. The sound stopped instantly. The lights in that building flickered and died, plunging the interior back into darkness. I saw Dmitri stumble backward, heard him curse in Russian, watched him spin around to face the rest of the village. One by one, building by building, the lights were going out, and with each extinguished light, the sounds moved closer, footsteps approaching from every direction, whispered conversations growing louder, children's laughter echoing from streets that remained completely empty, no matter where we pointed our flashlights. Sergei was shouting at us to get to the vehicle. We ran through the darkness, our flashlight beams cutting wild arcs through the black air, while the sounds of the village surrounded us like a closing fist. I could hear breathing now, close behind me, the heavy breath of someone running to keep pace. I could feel something almost touching my shoulder, fingers reaching for the back of my coat, but every time I spun around, there was nothing there. We reached the vehicle. Yuri was already in the driver's seat, turning the key, trying to start the engine. Nothing happened. He tried again. The engine didn't even turn over. No lights on the dashboard. No response from any electrical system. Something had drained the battery completely, had killed every system in the vehicle as thoroughly as if it had sat abandoned for 36 years. We walked out of Kolodny that night, 40 kilometers through polar darkness, temperatures approaching -50, following the tracks our vehicle had left in the snow 2 days before. Sergei led the way, checking his compass obsessively, refusing to stop no matter how much our lungs burned and our legs ached. Behind us, for the first 10 kilometers, we could see the lights of the village glowing on the horizon. We could hear the sounds carrying across the frozen tundra. Voices, laughter, music. Then everything went dark and silent, as suddenly as it had begun, and we were alone in the void. We reached the nearest inhabited settlement as the first gray hint of twilight touched the southern horizon, still weeks away from actual sunrise, but enough to convince us that we had survived. The residents took us in, gave us warm food and warmer drinks, and asked no questions when we refused to explain where we had come from. The footage we captured in Kolodny is still on our hard drives. 4 of us have copies. None of us have ever watched it. None of us ever will. Some things are not meant to be seen. Some places remember their inhabitants long after those inhabitants are gone. And some nights, when the darkness feels absolute and the silence feels heavy, I still hear the sounds of that village waking up. I still hear the children laughing in empty schoolhouses. I still hear the footsteps following, just behind me, never quite catching up. Story 4. The job posting appeared on an obscure employment board for remote work opportunities in the Russian Far East, mining supply depot in the Chukotka Autonomous Region, 2-month rotation during winter season. Salary listed was nearly triple what I could make in a year at my regular job in Magadan. The requirements were minimal: basic mechanical knowledge, ability to work in extreme isolation, psychological stability. I applied without hesitation, driven by debts I couldn't pay, and a marriage that had already collapsed under the weight of financial stress. I needed money desperately enough to ignore every instinct telling me something was wrong with an offer that seemed too good to be true. The depot served a gold mining operation about 40 kilometers to the north. Our job was simple: receive supply shipments when weather permitted, maintain inventory, dispatch equipment and materials when the mining crews requested them. 4 people working rotating shifts to ensure 24-hour coverage. The company provided housing, food, a satellite phone for emergencies, and a small library of books and films to help pass the time. What they didn't provide was any real preparation for what happens to the human mind when it goes 60 consecutive days without seeing the sun. I arrived in late November, transported by helicopter from the regional capital, along with my 3 colleagues. Dmitri was a former military man in his 50s, stocky and quiet, with the kind of 1,000-yard stare that suggested he had seen things he preferred not to discuss. Anya was younger, perhaps 30, an engineer from Novosibirsk who said she had taken the job to escape a difficult situation at home. Sergei was the oldest among us, a weathered Siberian who claimed to have worked remote postings his entire adult life. He seemed the most comfortable with the isolation, joking about the darkness as if it were an old friend he was looking forward to seeing again. The depot itself was a collection of prefabricated buildings arranged around a central warehouse. Living quarters, mess hall, equipment storage, a small medical station stocked with basic supplies. Everything was functional but worn, clearly designed for utility rather than comfort. The previous crew had left the day before our arrival, extracted by the same helicopter that delivered us. I remember thinking they looked relieved as they boarded, eager to escape despite the substantial paycheck they were leaving with. One of them caught my eye as the rotors started spinning and shook his head slowly, almost sadly, before disappearing into the aircraft. The first 2 weeks passed without incident. We established routines. Dmitry preferred the night shifts, though the concept of night had already lost meaning, as the sun dropped below the horizon and refused to return. Anya kept meticulous records of inventory and supply movements, her engineer's mind finding comfort in organization. Sergei cooked most of our meals, simple but hearty dishes that reminded me of my grandmother's kitchen. I handled equipment maintenance, losing myself in the mechanical problems that provided structure to days that otherwise blurred together. The darkness was absolute, not the darkness of a moonless night in a city where ambient light still softens the edges of things. This was primordial blackness, the kind that existed before humanity learned to make fire. When I stepped outside to check the generators or clear snow from equipment, my headlamp created a small bubble of visibility surrounded by walls of impenetrable void. The stars were brilliant when the clouds cleared, but even their cold light seemed fragile against the weight of the polar night. By the third week, Dmitry stopped sleeping. I noticed it first during a shift change. He should have been in his bunk, resting after 8 hours of monitoring communications and inventory systems. Instead, I found him sitting by the window of the common room, staring out at the darkness with an intensity that made my skin crawl. When I asked him what he was doing, he pointed toward the horizon and told me to look at the sun. There was no sun. The horizon was invisible, swallowed by the same blackness that consumed everything beyond our small circle of artificial light. I told him this gently, thinking perhaps he was simply disoriented from the disrupted sleep patterns that affected all of us to some degree. He shook his head and insisted I look more carefully. He described its position, just below the horizon, fighting to rise. He described its color, a deep orange bleeding into red, painting the snow with warmth we should have been able to feel. He described the way it flickered, like a candle flame guttering in wind, struggling against something that was trying to keep it down. I saw nothing. Anya saw nothing when she joined us, drawn by the intensity of Dmitry's conviction. Sergei stood in the doorway and watched with an expression I couldn't read, then returned to the kitchen without comment. Dmitry didn't sleep again for the remainder of our rotation. He sat by that window for hours each day, describing the sun's desperate attempts to rise, while the rest of us saw only darkness. His descriptions grew more detailed over time. He could see colors we had no names for. He could see shapes moving across the face of the struggling sun, shadows that seemed to be holding it down. He stopped eating regularly. He stopped responding to direct questions unless they were about what he was seeing. By the fourth week, he was little more than a fixture of the common room, a human statue staring at something the rest of us couldn't perceive. Anya's deterioration was different, but equally disturbing. It started around the 5th week, during a routine meal in the mess hall. She suddenly laughed, a genuine, delighted laugh, and responded to something none of us had said. When we stared at her in confusion, she continued the conversation she was apparently having, answering questions we hadn't asked, agreeing with statements we hadn't made. She referenced topics we had never discussed. She quoted jokes none of us had told. When I interrupted her, asking who she was talking to, she looked at me with genuine puzzlement and said she was talking to all of us. She had been talking to all of us for hours. We had been discussing our childhoods, our fears, our regrets. Didn't I remember telling her about my father's death? Didn't Sergei remember crying when he described his first wife? Sergei had never mentioned a first wife. I had never discussed my father with anyone at the depot. Whatever conversations Anya was experiencing, they existed only in her mind, conversations with versions of us that spoke truths we had never shared. She continued this way for the next week, oscillating between lucidity and interaction with invisible companions. Sometimes she would catch herself mid-sentence, look around in confusion, and apologize. Other times she would become agitated when we didn't remember the discussions she was certain we had just finished. She accused us of lying, of gaslighting her, of trying to make her think she was crazy. Then she would calm down and return to conversing with people who weren't there. I stayed as sane as I could by focusing on my work. Equipment needed maintenance. Generators needed fuel. Snow needed clearing. I buried myself in physical labor during the endless darkness, exhausting my body in hopes that it would quiet my mind. But the isolation was getting to me too. I found myself talking to myself during solo tasks, having entire conversations aloud just to hear a human voice. I started leaving the radio on constantly, filling the silence with static and occasional transmissions from distant stations. I avoided looking at the windows, afraid I might start seeing what Dmitri saw. I avoided lingering conversations with Anya, afraid I might start hearing what she heard. Then came day 41, and Sergei walked into the darkness. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't leave a note. He simply stood up from the dinner table, walked to the exterior door, and stepped outside without his coat, without a flashlight, without any of the survival gear required for even a brief excursion in those temperatures. Anya was deep in conversation with her invisible companions and didn't notice. Dmitri never looked away from the window where the sun was apparently still struggling to rise. I was in the equipment shed, running diagnostics on a faulty generator, and only learned what had happened when I returned to find the exterior door standing open and snow blowing into the hallway. We searched for him within the approved zones around the depot. Safety protocols prohibited us from venturing more than 500 meters from the buildings without authorization, and with Sergei gone, we had no one qualified to approve extended searches. I called the emergency line on the satellite phone and reported him missing. They told us to stay put, to wait for the scheduled helicopter extraction on day 62, to document everything but not to risk ourselves searching in the polar darkness. I found his tracks the next morning. They led straight north, toward the mining operation 40 kilometers away, into the endless blackness. The footprints were evenly spaced, unhurried, as if Sergei were taking a casual stroll rather than walking to his death, in temperatures that would kill an exposed human in less than an hour. They disappeared after about 200 meters, either erased by wind or simply swallowed by the darkness that had been consuming us all since our arrival. The last 3 weeks were the worst. Dmitri's descriptions of the struggling sun became increasingly frantic. He insisted it was dying, that the shadows holding it down were winning, that if it failed to rise, we would all be trapped in darkness forever. He started crying at some point during week 7, tears that froze on his cheeks as he pressed himself against the cold glass. He begged the sun to try harder, to break free, to save us from what was waiting in the darkness. He stopped responding to his name. He stopped acknowledging our presence entirely, existing in a world where only he and the dying sun remained. Anya's invisible companions became hostile during the final week. She would cower in corners, hands over her ears, begging them to stop saying such terrible things. She would scream at empty rooms, defending herself against accusations we couldn't hear. Twice I found her hiding in storage closets, convinced that someone was coming for her, that they were angry about something she had said, that they were going to hurt her. The only person she seemed to recognize anymore was someone I couldn't see, someone she called Masha, someone she pleaded with for forgiveness. And then there was what happened in the final 3 days. What the darkness showed us, what we became when the isolation stripped away everything that made us human. I don't speak about those days. I don't let myself remember them. The memories surface sometimes in dreams, fragments of images and sounds that make me wake up screaming, but I push them back down before they can fully form. Some things are not meant to be carried by the conscious mind. Some things can only exist in the darkness where they were born. The helicopter arrived on day 62, exactly as scheduled. A single pilot, prepared to extract 4 personnel and any priority cargo. He found me sitting in the common room, alone, staring at nothing. Dmitri's seat by the window was empty. Anya's conversations had finally gone silent. Sergei had walked into the darkness 3 weeks before. The pilot asked about my colleagues. He needed to account for all personnel, to file proper reports, to explain why only one person was waiting for extraction. I told him they had left early. A supply transport, I said, during a brief window of acceptable weather. They had been picked up 2 weeks ago, transferred to other assignments. I don't know why I lied. Maybe because I knew he wouldn't believe the truth. Maybe because I couldn't bear to speak the truth aloud. Maybe because some part of me understood that what happened in that depot belonged to the darkness, and bringing it into the light would only spread the contamination. The pilot accepted my explanation without question. He loaded me into the helicopter, performed his pre-flight checks, and lifted us into the black sky. As we gained altitude, I looked down at the depot shrinking below us, at the small cluster of buildings surrounded by infinite darkness. For just a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing by the window of the common room, watching our departure. Then the clouds closed beneath us, and the depot disappeared, and I never saw that place again. I still can't sleep when the nights grow long. I still avoid windows after sunset. I still hear echoes sometimes, conversations I never had, laughter from people who aren't there. The darkness never fully leaves you once it gets inside. It just waits, patient and eternal, for the sun to forget to rise. Story 5. My father was the kind of man who belonged to the wilderness more than he ever belonged to civilization. He worked as a geologist for a state mining company, spending months at a time in some of the most remote regions of Siberia, mapping mineral deposits and assessing extraction sites. When he wasn't working, he was hunting. The taiga was his church, the frozen tundra his sanctuary. He used to tell me that the land spoke to him in ways that people never could, that there was a purity in the silence of the Arctic that cleansed something deep in his soul. I believed him. I worshipped him. He was my hero in every way a father can be to a young boy. He disappeared in November of 1998 during a solo hunting expedition in the Taimyr Peninsula. He had gone after reindeer, planning to be gone for 10 days, following migration routes he had tracked for years. When he didn't return on the scheduled date, my mother contacted the authorities. Search teams were dispatched, helicopters deployed, every available resource thrown at finding one man in one of the most inhospitable landscapes on Earth. They found his campsite on day 4. The tent was still standing, his supplies still organized, his rifle still leaning against a rock where he had apparently left it. But my father was gone. His tracks led north from the camp, into an area of frozen marshland that became impassable during the polar night. The searchers followed as far as they could, but the tracks simply ended after about 3 kilometers. No sign of a fall through ice. No evidence of animal attack. No indication of where he had gone or why he had left his equipment behind. He had simply walked into the darkness and vanished. The search continued for 2 weeks before conditions made it impossible to proceed. Temperatures dropped below -50. Blizzards rolled through with increasing frequency. The polar night deepened into its most absolute phase, making visual searches nearly impossible. Eventually, the authorities declared my father presumed dead, his body unrecoverable. We held a funeral in our village near Norilsk, burying an empty casket beneath the frozen ground. I was 14 years old, and I understood nothing except that my father was never coming home. The years that followed were difficult in ways I still struggle to articulate. My mother retreated into grief, then into alcohol, then into an early grave when I was 22. I moved to Moscow for university, then to St. Petersburg for work, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the memories that haunted the Arctic. I built a career, found a wife, had a daughter of my own. I tried to forget the father who had walked into the darkness and never returned. But some wounds never fully heal. Some questions never stop demanding answers. By 2017, I was 43 years old, and the need for closure had become unbearable. I needed to see the place where my father had disappeared. I needed to stand in his footsteps, to understand what might have happened, to say goodbye in the only way that felt meaningful. My wife thought I was foolish. My daughter thought I was brave. I wasn't sure which of them was right. I hired a guide named Oleg through a wilderness expedition company in Norilsk. He was a taciturn man in his 60s, a lifelong resident of the region who had spent decades leading scientists, journalists, and the occasional tourist through landscapes that would kill the unprepared without hesitation. When I explained what I was looking for, he grew quiet. He asked me to repeat the coordinates, the date, the circumstances of my father's disappearance. Then he asked if I was certain I wanted to go there during polar night. I told him it had to be polar night. That was when my father had vanished. That was the only way I could truly understand what he had experienced in his final days. Oleg agreed, reluctantly, and we set out in early December with enough supplies for 2 weeks. The journey took us northeast from Norilsk, first by truck along frozen roads, then by snowmobile across terrain that had no roads at all. The polar night had already begun. The sun, a memory that wouldn't return for another month. We traveled by GPS and headlamp, navigating through absolute darkness toward coordinates that had haunted my dreams for 19 years. We reached the approximate location on the third day. The landscape was featureless, an endless expanse of frozen tundra, broken only by occasional ridges and the distant silhouettes of low hills. I recognized nothing. There was nothing to recognize. Whatever had been my father's campsite was long buried beneath 2 decades of snow and ice. But I felt something as we made our own camp, something I couldn't name, a heaviness in the air, a thickness in the darkness that seemed more than just absence of light. Oleg felt it too. He was uneasy from the moment we stopped, checking the perimeter obsessively, keeping his rifle closer than seemed necessary. When I asked him what was wrong, he just shook his head and told me to stay near the fire. Some places, he said, had memory. Some places remembered what had happened to them, and they didn't always remember kindly. I didn't sleep well that first night. The darkness outside our small camp was absolute, our fire and headlamps creating an island of visibility in an ocean of black. I lay in my sleeping bag and listened to the silence, straining for any sound that might break the oppressive quiet. There was nothing, not even wind, just the crackle of our fire and the occasional shift of Oleg keeping watch. The second night was the same. Darkness, silence, unease. I spent hours staring at the coordinates on my GPS, thinking about my father walking this same frozen ground, wondering what he had seen, what he had felt, what had drawn him away from his camp and into the void. On the third night, he came back. I was sitting by the fire, trying to read from a book I had brought, when the darkness at the edge of our camp seemed to thicken. I looked up, expecting to see Oleg returning from a perimeter check, and instead saw a figure emerging from the blackness. A man, walking slowly toward our fire, his silhouette gradually taking shape as the light reached him. My heart stopped. My breath caught in my throat, because the figure was wearing my father's coat, the same heavy winter parka he had worn in every photograph from my childhood, the same distinctive collar, the same pattern of patches on the sleeves. And as he came closer, I saw his face. It was my father, exactly as I remembered him, not aged by 19 years, not weathered by decades in the wilderness. He looked exactly as he had the last time I saw him, the morning he left for his hunting trip, the morning he hugged me and promised to bring back stories of the reindeer he would track. Same weathered face, same gray-touched beard, same rifle slung over his shoulder. He sat down across the fire from me and smiled. The smile I remembered, the smile that had made me feel safe and loved and certain that everything in the world would be all right. He spoke my name, my childhood nickname, the one only he had ever used. He said he had been waiting for me, 19 years in the darkness, waiting for me to come back for him. He knew I would come eventually. He knew I wouldn't abandon him forever. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I sat frozen, staring at the face of my dead father, trying to understand what I was seeing. Part of me screamed that this was impossible, that corpses didn't wait 19 years in the frozen dark, that whatever sat across the fire from me couldn't be real. But another part of me, the part that had never stopped being a 14-year-old boy mourning his hero, wanted desperately to believe. Then Oleg grabbed my arm. He had returned from wherever he had been, approaching silently from behind me, and his grip was so tight it hurt. He was shaking, not from cold, from terror. He leaned close to my ear and whispered that we needed to leave immediately. We needed to run. We needed to get as far from this place as possible. I asked him why, still unable to tear my eyes from my father's face. Oleg pointed at the ground beside the fire, at the place where the flames cast dancing shadows across the snow. I looked at my father's shadow. The shadow wasn't shaped like a man. The firelight should have cast a simple silhouette, the dark outline of a seated human figure. Instead, the shadow was wrong in ways my mind struggled to process. Too many limbs extended from it, bending at angles that human bones don't allow. Parts of it moved independently, twitching and writhing, even though the figure sitting across from me remained perfectly still. The shadow stretched far beyond what the physics of light should have permitted, reaching toward me across the snow, like fingers grasping for something just out of reach. My father was still smiling, but the smile had changed. It was too wide now, stretching beyond the boundaries of his face, and his eyes had gone dark in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of light. I asked the thing wearing my father's face what had happened to him, what had really happened 19 years ago when a man walked into the darkness and never returned. The smile vanished. The expression that replaced it was ancient, hungry, utterly inhuman, despite wearing human features. When it spoke again, the voice was no longer my father's. It was something else, something that had never been human, something that had learned to mimic humanity the way a hunter learns to mimic the call of its prey. It said my father was delicious. The word hung in the air between us, terrible and absolute. I understood then, with a clarity that bordered on madness, that whatever sat across the fire had worn other faces before my father's, that it had waited in this darkness for longer than human history could measure, that my father had been food, had been absorbed, had been consumed in ways that went beyond the physical. The thing stood up, not the way a human stands, unfolding from a seated position. It rose wrongly, limbs bending backward, body elongating in directions that made my eyes water and my stomach heave. The face remained my father's, still smiling that too-wide smile, but the body beneath had stopped pretending. It walked backward into the darkness, not turning around, not breaking eye contact, just retreating step by impossible step into the void from which it had emerged. The polar night swallowed it gradually, darkness claiming first the edges, then the limbs, then the torso, until only the face remained, floating in blackness, smiling at me. Then it was gone, and I was screaming. We fled that place in the darkest hours of the polar night, abandoning half our equipment in our desperate need to escape. Oleg led us south by GPS, not stopping until we had covered nearly 40 kilometers, not speaking except to issue terse directions. When we finally made camp again, exhausted beyond the point of rational thought, he told me that he had seen such things before, not personally, but in the stories of the old people, the indigenous populations who had lived in these lands for thousands of years. They had names for creatures that wore human faces, that consumed travelers in the polar darkness, that waited with patience beyond human comprehension for prey foolish enough to enter their territory. My father had walked into the hunting ground of something that should not exist, and 19 years later, that something had worn his face to smile at his son. I returned to St. Petersburg and tried to resume my normal life. I held my daughter close and told her stories about her grandfather that carefully edited out the truth. I deleted the GPS coordinates from every device I owned, though I know I could never truly forget them. But some nights, when the winter darkness presses against my windows, I see my father's face in the shadows, still smiling, still waiting, still hungry. Story 6. The four of us had been planning the trip for nearly 2 years. Anton was the organizer, a physics graduate student at Moscow State University with an obsession for astrophotography that bordered on religious fervor. Dmitry handled equipment, a mechanical engineer who could fix anything with moving parts and had built half our observation gear from scratch. Katya was our meteorologist, a quiet woman with an uncanny ability to predict weather patterns that made her invaluable for planning observation windows. And then there was me, Mikhail, the amateur of the group, a software developer whose contribution was mostly enthusiasm and a willingness to fund a significant portion of the expedition. Our goal was simple. The polar night in the Yakutia region offered some of the darkest skies on Earth, completely free of light pollution for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. For 3 weeks in January, we would have optimal conditions for photographing deep sky objects that were nearly impossible to capture elsewhere. Nebulae, distant galaxies, star clusters that most amateur astronomers could only dream of documenting. We had rented a research cabin from a scientific station that used it for summer fieldwork, paying a premium for winter access that the owners seemed almost reluctant to grant. The journey to the cabin took 2 days by vehicle from Yakutsk, followed by 3 hours on snowmobiles across terrain that had no roads and barely any landmarks. By the time we arrived, the polar night had been in full effect for nearly a month. The sun was a theoretical concept, a memory from a world that seemed impossibly distant. Our headlamps carved small tunnels of visibility through darkness, so complete it felt solid, as if we were pushing through black fabric rather than empty air. The cabin itself was sturdy and well-maintained, a timber structure built to withstand the brutal Siberian winters. It had a main room with a wood stove, 4 bunks in a separate sleeping area, a small kitchen, and most importantly, a flat roof with an unobstructed view of the entire sky. We spent the first 2 days setting up our equipment, calibrating our instruments, and establishing routines that would maximize our observation time. The darkness was perfect, The cold was brutal but manageable. Everything seemed to be going exactly as planned. The first 11 days passed in a rhythm of observation, sleep, and meals heated on the wood stove. We captured images that exceeded our most optimistic expectations. The Orion Nebula blazed with colors no camera in Moscow could ever record. The Andromeda Galaxy stretched across our frames with detail that made us gasp. We were drunk on success, high on the realization that our years of planning had paid off beyond our dreams. Then came day 12, and the knocking began. It was approximately 3 in the morning, though time had lost much of its meaning in the endless darkness. Anton and I were in the main room, reviewing photographs on a laptop, while Dmitri slept and Katya monitored weather data from her instruments. The blizzard had started around midnight, reducing visibility to essentially zero and creating a constant howl of wind that made the cabin walls groan. 3 solid knocks on the front door, not the random tapping of wind-blown debris. Deliberate knocks, spaced evenly, with the unmistakable rhythm of a human hand. We froze. Anton and I exchanged looks of confusion and growing alarm. The nearest settlement was over 30 kilometers away. No one could travel in these conditions without serious equipment and serious motivation. But the knocking had been clear, unmistakable. Someone was at our door. I thought of emergency scenarios. A lost traveler from the scientific station, a hunter who had become disoriented in the storm, someone whose vehicle had broken down, who had somehow made it to our cabin through sheer desperation. Whoever was out there needed help. In these temperatures, in this storm, being outside meant death within hours, if not minutes. I opened the door. There was nothing there, only darkness so complete my headlamp seemed to die within a meter of the threshold, swallowed by swirling snow and absolute black void. The wind howled past, driving ice crystals that stung my exposed face. I called out, shouting to be heard over the storm, asking if anyone was there. No response. Nothing but darkness and cold and the endless shriek of wind. I closed the door and told Anton I must have imagined it. Auditory hallucination from the wind, perhaps. The storm playing tricks on isolated minds. He nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't convinced. 10 minutes later, 3 more knocks. We both heard them clearly this time. 3 solid impacts on the wooden door, the same rhythm as before. I grabbed a flashlight and threw open the door again, this time stepping partially outside, sweeping the light in all directions. Nothing. No footprints in the snow, though the blizzard would have covered tracks within seconds. No figure retreating into the darkness. Just the storm and the cold and the terrible weight of the polar night pressing down on everything. This continued for 6 hours. Every 10 minutes precisely, 3 knocks. We timed them, watching the clock, waiting for each set with growing dread. Sometimes Anton would open the door, sometimes I would. Once, Dmitri woke and checked himself, convinced we were playing some kind of elaborate prank. Each time, the same result. Nothing there, nothing visible, nothing that should have been capable of making those sounds. By morning, which was still pitch black but indicated by our watches as the time when activity should resume, we decided to set up surveillance. Dmitri rigged one of our cameras to face the door, recording continuously in high definition with infrared capability for the darkness. We would catch whatever was making those sounds. We would have evidence, explanation, something to make sense of what was happening. The knocking continued throughout the day. Every 10 minutes, 3 knocks. The camera recorded all of it. We watched in real time on a monitor in the main room, waiting to see whatever figure would appear to make those sounds. No one ever appeared. The footage showed our door, the frame, the snow swirling past the threshold. At precise 10-minute intervals, we could see the door shake slightly, responding to impacts that clearly came from something solid, but there was no hand making those impacts. No figure standing at our entrance. The knocks came from empty air, from the darkness itself, from something that existed just beyond what our camera could perceive. 14 hours of footage, 84 sets of knocks, nothing visible on any frame. Katya suggested reviewing the audio separately, isolating it from the visual component to analyze more carefully. She had software on her laptop for weather sound analysis, capable of filtering and enhancing audio frequencies. We transferred the footage and let her work, while the rest of us sat in uncomfortable silence, listening to the endless knocking that continued even as we analyzed it. What she found made my blood run cold in ways the Siberian winter never could. Behind the knocking, almost completely buried in the howl of the blizzard, was another sound. Breathing, heavy, wet breathing, like a large animal panting after exertion, or a person breathing through a mouth filled with fluid. The breathing was continuous between knocks, never pausing, never changing rhythm, as if whatever was making it needed no rest. And beneath the breathing, barely audible, even with Katya's enhancement software, was a voice, whispering in Russian, repeating the same phrase over and over in a tone that made every hair on my body stand rigid. "Thank you for answering. Now I know you're home." We left that night. We didn't discuss it. We didn't debate. We simply began packing, each of us moving with frantic efficiency, abandoning equipment that had taken 2 years to assemble because nothing was worth staying another hour in that cabin. The knocking continued as we loaded the snowmobiles, 3 solid impacts every 10 minutes, patient and precise, as if whatever was making them knew we weren't leaving fast enough to matter. The journey back to civilization was a nightmare of darkness and cold and terror. We drove through the night and the following day, stopping only to refuel, pushing ourselves to the edge of collapse to put distance between us and that cabin. By the time we reached Yakutsk, we were half frozen, exhausted, and unable to explain to ourselves what we had experienced. I contacted the cabin owner a week later, after I had returned to Moscow and attempted to resume something resembling normal life. I told him about the knocking, about the breathing, about the whispered voice on our recordings. I expected him to dismiss my account as hallucination or exaggeration. Instead, he went very quiet. He told me that the previous renters had experienced the same thing. A research team from Japan, studying permafrost samples, who had cut their trip short after 10 days and refused to explain why. Before them, a documentary crew who had left after only a week, leaving behind expensive equipment in their haste to escape. And before them, 2 years ago, a group of 4 Russian hikers who had rented the cabin for a winter expedition. They had stayed until day 15. On day 15, according to the owner, they had opened the door one final time. Perhaps they had grown accustomed to the knocking. Perhaps they had decided to confront whatever was making it. Perhaps they had simply made a mistake, their judgment compromised by 2 weeks of isolation and unexplainable phenomena. Their bodies were found a week later, 40 kilometers from the cabin, scattered across the tundra in a pattern that suggested they had been running. All 4 were frozen solid, their faces twisted into expressions of absolute terror, their mouths open in screams that no one had been alive to hear. The cause of death was officially hypothermia. The official explanation was that they had become disoriented in a storm and died of exposure. But the owner told me something the official reports hadn't mentioned, something the investigators had chosen not to include in their documentation. The bodies had been found with their backs to the cabin, all 4 of them, facing away, as if they had been fleeing from something that had come out of that door, something that had chased them across 40 kilometers of frozen darkness. And on each of their backs, pressed into the frozen fabric of their jackets, was a handprint, too large to be human, too long in the fingers, pressed so deep it had left marks on the skin beneath. I never returned to that cabin. None of us did. Anton abandoned his astrophotography hobby entirely. Dmitri moved to Spain, as far from Siberian winters as he could get. Katya refused to discuss what we had experienced and eventually stopped responding to my messages altogether. I still have the audio file Katya extracted from our footage. The breathing, the whispered voice. "Thank you for answering. Now I know you're home." I tell myself I keep it as evidence, as documentation of something that needs to be remembered. But sometimes, late at night, I play it just to remind myself it was real. And sometimes when I do, I hear something new in the background, something that wasn't there in the original recording. A sound like knocking, 3 solid impacts, patient and precise. As if whatever was at that cabin door in Yakutia has learned where I live now. As if it knows I'm home. Story 7. My family has herded reindeer across the Yamal Peninsula for 7 generations. Before my great-great-great-grandfather walked these frozen lands, before the Russians came with their maps and their borders, before the concept of nations meant anything in this part of the world, the Nenets people followed the reindeer. We learned their rhythms, their instincts, their silent language. We learned to read the tundra through their eyes, to sense danger through their ears, to survive the polar night by trusting what they knew. I was born into this life. My earliest memories are of riding in sleds pulled by reindeer, of sleeping in chums heated by reindeer hide walls, of drinking warm blood mixed with milk during the coldest nights when nothing else could keep the chill from your bones. By the time I was 10, I could track a herd across trackless snow. By 15, I could sense a storm coming hours before the sky changed. By 20, I had made the full migration 3 times, from the summer pastures near the Kara Sea to the winter grounds in the southern forests and back again. My grandfather taught me everything he knew, and his grandfather had taught him, passing down wisdom that stretched back further than memory. He taught me about the dangers of thin ice and sudden blizzards. He taught me about wolves and how to protect the herd when they grew desperate in the deepest cold. He taught me about the spirits that lived in the land, the old beliefs that we maintained even as the modern world crept closer with each passing year. And he taught me the rules, the unwritten laws that every Nenets herder learned before they learned to walk. Never camp where the reindeer refuse to rest. Never cross water when the animals won't enter. Never travel when the lead deer turns back. And above all else, when the reindeer refuse to move, you don't make them. I never questioned these rules. I had seen too many examples of what happened when outsiders ignored the wisdom of the animals. Researchers who pushed forward when their guides urged caution, only to fall through ice or walk straight into whiteout conditions. Oil company workers who laughed at our superstitions and later had to be rescued from situations that should have killed them. The reindeer knew things we couldn't perceive. Their instincts had been honed by thousands of years of survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Only a fool would disregard their warnings. The winter of 2016 tested everything I thought I understood about those warnings. We were midway through the autumn migration, moving south with our herd of nearly 3,000 animals. The polar night had begun 3 weeks earlier, the sun dropping below the horizon and refusing to return until late January. We traveled by starlight and headlamp, by the aurora borealis, when it chose to dance across the sky, by the intimate knowledge of terrain that let us navigate without seeing more than a few meters in any direction. The herd moved steadily, the lead animals following routes their ancestors had traveled for centuries. On the 7th day of our journey, the herd stopped. It wasn't a gradual slowing, the way animals pause when they need to graze or rest. It was sudden and absolute. 3,000 reindeer, frozen in place as if someone had thrown a switch. They stood motionless on the frozen tundra, their breath forming clouds that hung in the still air, their eyes fixed on the darkness to the north. My uncle was at the front of the column, riding his snowmobile alongside the lead animals. He radioed back to report that the herd wouldn't respond to commands. He had tried calling to them, circling around to encourage movement, even firing his rifle into the air to startle them forward. Nothing worked. The reindeer simply stood and stared, utterly unresponsive, as if they had been transformed into statues. We gathered as a family to discuss what to do. There were 12 of us making this migration, 3 generations working together as we had for as long as anyone could remember. The younger members wanted to push forward, to force the herd into motion, to stay on schedule for the trading post, where we would sell some of the animals and resupply for winter. But my grandfather raised his hand for silence, and we all fell quiet. He was 91 years old that winter, his face weathered by 9 decades of Arctic wind, his eyes still sharp despite the years. He had seen things on the tundra that none of us could imagine, had survived challenges that would have killed men half his age. When he spoke, we listened. He told us about the watching time, a phenomenon the old herders had spoken of in hushed voices, something that happened perhaps once in a generation, when the animals sensed something passing through the land that humans could not perceive. During the watching time, he said, the reindeer would not move because moving meant drawing attention. They became still because stillness meant survival. Whatever was out there in the darkness, it was something ancient, something that predated the reindeer themselves, something that commanded a respect born of primal terror. He told us to make camp and wait. He told us to keep the fires small and our voices quiet. He told us not to look toward the north, no matter what we heard. We set up our chums in a tight cluster, the portable tents forming a small island of humanity in the vast darkness. The reindeer remained where they had stopped, unmoving, their eyes still fixed on that single point in the polar night. We ate cold food to avoid the smoke of cooking fires. We spoke in whispers, when we spoke at all. We waited. The first day passed without incident. The herd remained frozen. The darkness remained absolute. We took shifts keeping watch. though none of us were certain what we were watching for. The second day was the same. The reindeer hadn't moved a step, hadn't eaten, hadn't broken their vigil toward the north. Some of the animals had urinated where they stood, their bodies responding to biological needs even as their minds remained locked in whatever trance gripped them. My grandfather sat outside his chum for hours, his eyes closed, his lips moving in prayers or incantations that none of us could hear. On the third night, we heard it. It began as a vibration, a trembling in the frozen ground that I felt through my sleeping furs before I heard anything. Then came the sound, footsteps, but not the footsteps of any creature I had ever encountered. These were impossibly heavy, each impact shaking the earth like a small earthquake, each stride covering a distance that defied comprehension. Something massive was walking through the darkness beyond the reach of our meager firelight. I lay in my chum, paralyzed with a fear I had never experienced before. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, passing somewhere to the north of our camp. I could track their progress by the trembling of the ground, by the direction of the impacts. Whatever was making those sounds was enormous, not mammoth-sized, bigger, something that shouldn't have been able to exist, that couldn't possibly be walking through the modern world on legs that shook the frozen tundra. The reindeer began to tremble. All 3,000 of them, still motionless, still staring into the darkness, but now shaking with a terror that seemed to affect them as a single organism. I could hear them, even inside my tent, even over the sound of those impossible footsteps. The soft rattling of their bodies, the chattering of their teeth, the small sounds of animals too frightened to run, too frightened to fight, too frightened to do anything but stand and shake and pray that the thing passing through the darkness would not notice them. I wanted to look. Every instinct screamed at me to peer through the flap of my chum, to try to catch a glimpse of whatever was making those sounds. But my grandfather's warning echoed in my mind. Do not look toward the north. Do not draw its attention. Do not let it know that you are watching. The footsteps lasted for perhaps an hour, though time had lost all meaning in the darkness and terror of that night. They gradually faded, moving south, the trembling of the ground diminishing with distance until finally, silence returned to the tundra. I didn't sleep. I don't think any of us did. When the time came that dawn should have arrived, when our watches told us the sun should have been fighting to rise above the horizon even if it wouldn't succeed, the reindeer began to move. They shook themselves, as if waking from a deep sleep, and resumed their march south, as if nothing had happened. The lead animals found the trail without guidance. The herd fell into formation without encouragement. Whatever had held them frozen for 3 days had released its grip. We packed our camp and followed, eager to put distance between ourselves and whatever had passed through. No one spoke about what we had heard. No one asked questions. We simply moved, grateful to be moving, grateful to be alive. We lost 47 animals before we reached the winter grounds. Not to predators, not to cold, not to illness or injury. They simply died, one after another, scattered throughout the herd over the following week. We would find them standing in the middle of the group, motionless, their eyes open and staring at nothing. When we approached, they would topple over, already stiff, already frozen. The veterinarian at the trading post couldn't explain it. Their hearts had simply stopped. No signs of disease, no evidence of poisoning, no marks from attack. 47 healthy reindeer had died of fright, their hearts giving out under the weight of a terror they couldn't escape. My grandfather died the following summer. He passed peacefully in his sleep during the long Arctic days, when the sun never set and the darkness seemed like a distant memory. I was with him at the end, holding his weathered hand as his breathing slowed and finally stopped. In his final hours, he had tried to tell me something about that night, about the watching time, about what had walked through the darkness beyond our camp. But the words wouldn't come, his voice too weak to form the sounds, his eyes filled with something I couldn't read. I have made the migration 17 more times since then. I have taught my own children the ways of the reindeer, passed down the wisdom that was given to me. I have told them all the rules, all the warnings, all the lessons that might keep them alive in the polar night. But I have never told them about the watching time. I have never described what we heard during those 3 nights in 2016, because some knowledge is too heavy to carry, because some things that walk through the darkness should remain unnamed and unremembered, because there are truths about this land that humans were never meant to understand. The reindeer know. They have always known. And when they refuse to move, I do not make them. I simply wait, and I do not look toward the north, and I pray that whatever is passing through will continue on its way without noticing the fragile humans huddled around their small fires, hoping the darkness will spare them for one more night. Story 8. My uncle Victor was the kind of man who saw the world differently than most people. While others looked at the Arctic and saw nothing but frozen desolation, he saw beauty waiting to be captured. While others feared the polar night, he saw opportunity. His photographs had appeared in National Geographic, Nature, and dozens of other prestigious publications. He had documented wildlife in conditions that would have killed lesser photographers. He was meticulous, experienced, and utterly fearless in pursuit of the perfect image. I grew up idolizing him. Every summer, he would visit our family in Moscow and show me his latest work, spreading photographs across our kitchen table while telling stories of the adventures behind each frame. He taught me about light and shadow, about patience and timing, about the sacred relationship between photographer and subject. When I turned 18, he gave me my first professional camera and told me that the lens was a window into worlds most people never saw. I believed him. I still do, though now that belief carries a weight it never did before. In the autumn of 2011, Victor announced his most ambitious project yet. He had secured funding to spend 2 months in northeastern Siberia during polar night, documenting wolf behavior in complete darkness, using specialized infrared equipment he had designed himself. The technology was cutting edge, capable of capturing images in conditions that would render normal photography impossible. He planned to photograph wolves hunting, feeding, and surviving in the endless Arctic night, revealing a world that human eyes had never truly seen. The family was worried, of course. Victor was 53 years old, and while he remained in excellent physical condition, the Siberian polar night was unforgiving, even to young men. The region he planned to visit was among the most remote on Earth, accessible only by helicopter during winter months, with the nearest inhabited settlement over 200 kilometers away. But Victor dismissed our concerns with his characteristic confidence. He had spent decades preparing for this expedition. He knew the risks. He knew how to survive. He departed in late October, transported by chartered helicopter to a predetermined base camp in the Verkhoyansk Range. He carried enough supplies for 3 months, along with satellite communication equipment that would allow him to check in weekly with a research station in Yakutsk. His plan was to spend the first month establishing camps along known wolf migration routes, then the second month capturing images as the polar night reached its deepest phase. For the first 6 weeks, everything went according to plan. Victor's weekly transmissions were enthusiastic, describing successful sightings and promising photographs that would revolutionize our understanding of Arctic wolf behavior. He had tracked a pack of 11 animals to their primary hunting grounds and was positioning himself for what he called the defining images of his career. His last transmission, on December 8th, mentioned that he was moving to a new location to follow the pack to their den site. He sounded excited. He sounded alive. That was the last time anyone heard from him. When Victor missed his next scheduled check-in, the research station in Yakutsk alerted the authorities. A search was organized, but conditions in the polar night made aerial reconnaissance nearly impossible. Ground teams were dispatched from the nearest settlements, but the distances involved meant progress was measured in days rather than hours. 3 weeks passed before searchers finally reached Victor's last known coordinates. They found his body seated against a large tree, approximately 2 kilometers from his final camp. He was frozen solid, his camera still clutched in his gloved hands, his eyes open and fixed on something in the distance. The official cause of death was hypothermia, accelerated by what appeared to be a fall that had injured his leg and prevented him from returning to shelter. A tragic accident, the authorities concluded. A respected photographer who had finally pushed his luck too far. The family accepted this explanation. We held a funeral, buried an empty casket because Victor had requested cremation years earlier and tried to move forward with our grief. His equipment was returned to us several months later, packed in the same cases he had carried into the wilderness. Most of it went into storage, too painful for any of us to examine closely. But I couldn't let go of his camera. It was the same model he had used to teach me photography, a professional-grade system he had modified over years to suit his specific needs. I told myself I was keeping it for sentimental reasons, that I would eventually use it to continue his work. But the truth was something else. Something about the circumstances of his death didn't sit right with me. Victor was too experienced to die from a simple fall, too prepared to succumb to hypothermia within walking distance of his shelter, too careful to make the kinds of mistakes that killed careless adventurers. A year after his death, I finally gathered the courage to examine the camera more closely. I found a roll of film still inside, undeveloped, preserved by the cold in the sealed chamber of the camera body. Victor had been a traditionalist in some ways, preferring film for certain applications, even as digital technology advanced. This roll was from his infrared equipment, designed to capture images in spectrums invisible to the human eye. I developed the photographs myself, in the darkroom I had built using techniques Victor taught me. The process was familiar, almost meditative, until the images began to emerge from the chemical bath. The first dozen photographs showed exactly what I expected. Arctic wolves captured in the strange, ethereal glow of infrared light. The images were stunning, even by Victor's standards. Wolves hunting across frozen tundra, their heat signatures blazing against the cold background. Wolves feeding on a fresh kill, their breath forming clouds that registered as bright plumes in the infrared spectrum. Wolves resting in the lee of rock formations, huddled together for warmth. Beautiful, unprecedented documentation of life in the polar darkness. The 13th photograph changed everything. It showed a wolf pack, perhaps the same 11 animals Victor had mentioned in his transmissions, moving across a snow-covered clearing. The composition was excellent, the lighting perfect for infrared capture. But in the background, at the very edge of the frame, stood something that shouldn't have been there. A figure, shaped vaguely like a man but impossibly tall, 10 feet at minimum, perhaps more. Its proportions were wrong in ways that made my stomach clench with instinctive revulsion. The arms hung too long, nearly reaching the ground. The legs bent backward at the knee, like a bird's legs, like something that had learned to mimic human form without understanding how human bodies actually worked. It was facing the wolf pack, but something about its posture suggested it was also facing the camera. It was watching the wolves. It was watching my uncle. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a heat signature from some geological formation. Pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces and figures in random patterns. I told myself anything except what I was actually seeing. Then I developed the 14th photograph. The figure was closer, not by much, perhaps 20 meters, but undeniably closer. The wolf pack had moved, and so had it, maintaining an angle that kept the wolves between itself and Victor's position. Its posture was different now, leaning forward slightly, intent. The 15th photograph, closer still. I could make out more details now, details I didn't want to see. The arms ended in something that might have been hands, but had too many joints. The head was smooth, featureless, without the hot spots that would indicate eyes or mouth. It moved through the frame like smoke, like something that existed only partially in the spectrum Victor's camera could capture. Photograph 16, 17, 18. Each image showed the figure advancing, while Victor apparently remained focused on the wolves. Did he see it? Did his human eyes perceive what his camera was recording? Or did he remain oblivious, concentrating on his art while something ancient and impossible stalked him through the polar darkness? The 19th photograph was the last one with the wolves in frame. They had moved on, disappearing into the night, leaving Victor alone with his camera, alone with the thing that had been following them, following him. Photographs 20 through 23 showed only the empty clearing, but the figure was in every frame, closer with each image. It filled more of the frame now, dominating the composition, blocking out the background with its impossible height and its wrong proportions. In photograph 22, I could see what might have been a face, smooth, like a mask, with indentations where features should have been. Looking at it made my head hurt. Looking at it made me want to scream. The 24th photograph was the last image on the roll. It was taken from a slightly lower angle than the others, as if Victor had slumped or fallen. The figure filled nearly the entire frame. It was directly behind the camera position, leaning over, one of those two long arms extended toward where Victor's shoulder would have been. The smooth face was angled downward, toward the lens, toward the man holding the camera. It seemed to be examining him, curious, patient, hungry. I sat in my dark room for a very long time after developing that final image. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I could only stare at the photograph and try to understand what I was seeing. What had seen my uncle, what had followed him through the polar darkness until it was close enough to touch. Eventually, I gathered enough composure to examine the camera more closely. I had been avoiding it, I realized, afraid of what else I might find. But I needed to know. I needed to understand. That's when I found the scratches. They were on the inside of the viewfinder, the small window Victor would have pressed his eye against to frame his shots. Deep grooves in the metal and glass, as if something with sharp edges had been scraping against the interior surface, trying to get out, trying to reach whatever was on the other side. The scratches weren't there when Victor departed for Siberia. I had helped him pack his equipment. I had looked through that viewfinder myself, testing the focus, admiring the craftsmanship. The interior had been pristine. Now it looked like something had been trapped inside, something that had fought desperately to escape. I destroyed the photographs, all of them. I burned the negatives and the prints, watching the images curl and blacken in the flames, watching the figure dissolve into ash and smoke. I told myself it was the responsible thing to do, that no one else should see what I had seen. I told myself I was protecting the world from knowledge it wasn't ready to receive. But the truth is, I was afraid. I was afraid that the camera had captured something real. I was afraid that looking at those images had created a connection, a window that worked in both directions. I was afraid that whatever had found my uncle in the Siberian darkness might find its way to me through the photographs he left behind. I still have the camera. I couldn't bring myself to destroy it. It sits in a locked box in my closet, untouched since the night I developed that final roll of film. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear scratching coming from inside the box. Soft, patient scratching, like something testing the boundaries of its prison. I never look. I never open the box. Because I remember the figure in those photographs. I remember how it got closer with each frame. I remember that smooth, featureless face angled toward the camera lens. And I wonder if it's still in there, waiting in the darkness behind the viewfinder, waiting for someone to look through and give it a way out. Story 9. The four of us had been planning the trip for nearly 2 years. Anton was the organizer, a physics graduate student at Moscow State University with an obsession for astrophotography that bordered on religious fervor. Dmitry handled equipment, a mechanical engineer who could fix anything with moving parts and had built half our observation gear from scratch. Katya was our meteorologist, a quiet woman with an uncanny ability to predict weather patterns that made her invaluable for planning observation windows. And then there was me, Mikhail, the amateur of the group, a software developer whose contribution was mostly enthusiasm and a willingness to fund a significant portion of the expedition. Our goal was simple. The polar night in the Yakutia region offered some of the darkest skies on Earth, completely free of light pollution for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. For 3 weeks in January, we would have optimal conditions for photographing deep sky objects that were nearly impossible to capture elsewhere. Nebulae, distant galaxies, star clusters that most amateur astronomers could only dream of documenting. We had rented a research cabin from a scientific station that used it for summer fieldwork, paying a premium for winter access that the owners seemed almost reluctant to grant. The journey to the cabin took 2 days by vehicle from Yakutsk, followed by 3 hours on snowmobiles across terrain that had no roads and barely any landmarks. By the time we arrived, the polar night had been in full effect for nearly a month. The sun was a theoretical concept, a memory from a world that seemed impossibly distant. Our headlamps carved small tunnels of visibility through darkness, so complete it felt solid, as if we were pushing through black fabric rather than empty air. The cabin itself was sturdy and well-maintained, a timber structure built to withstand the brutal Siberian winters. It had a main room with a wood stove, 4 bunks in a separate sleeping area, a small kitchen, and most importantly, a flat roof with an unobstructed view of the entire sky. We spent the first 2 days setting up our equipment, calibrating our instruments, and establishing routines that would maximize our observation time. The darkness was perfect, the cold was brutal but manageable. Everything seemed to be going exactly as planned. The first 11 days passed in a rhythm of observation, sleep, and meals heated on the wood stove. We captured images that exceeded our most optimistic expectations. The Orion Nebula blazed with colors no camera in Moscow could ever record. The Andromeda Galaxy stretched across our frames with detail that made us gasp. We were drunk on success, high on the realization that our years of planning had paid off beyond our dreams. Then came day 12, and the knocking began. It was approximately 3 in the morning, though time had lost much of its meaning in the endless darkness. Anton and I were in the main room, reviewing photographs on a laptop, while Dmitri slept and Katya monitored weather data from her instruments. The blizzard had started around midnight, reducing visibility to essentially zero and creating a constant howl of wind that made the cabin walls groan. 3 solid knocks on the front door, not the random tapping of wind-blown debris. Deliberate knocks, spaced evenly, with the unmistakable rhythm of a human hand. We froze. Anton and I exchanged looks of confusion and growing alarm. The nearest settlement was over 30 kilometers away. No one could travel in these conditions without serious equipment and serious motivation. But the knocking had been clear, unmistakable. Someone was at our door. I thought of emergency scenarios. A lost traveler from the scientific station, a hunter who had become disoriented in the storm, someone whose vehicle had broken down, who had somehow made it to our cabin through sheer desperation. Whoever was out there needed help. In these temperatures, in this storm, being outside meant death within hours, if not minutes. I opened the door. There was nothing there, only darkness so complete my headlamp seemed to die within a meter of the threshold, swallowed by swirling snow and absolute black void. The wind howled past, driving ice crystals that stung my exposed face. I called out, shouting to be heard over the storm, asking if anyone was there. No response. Nothing but darkness and cold and the endless shriek of wind. I closed the door and told Anton I must have imagined it. Auditory hallucination from the wind, perhaps. The storm playing tricks on isolated minds. He nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't convinced. 10 minutes later, 3 more knocks. We both heard them clearly this time. 3 solid impacts on the wooden door, the same rhythm as before. I grabbed a flashlight and threw open the door again, this time stepping partially outside, sweeping the light in all directions. Nothing. No footprints in the snow, though the blizzard would have covered tracks within seconds. No figure retreating into the darkness. Just the storm and the cold and the terrible weight of the polar night pressing down on everything. This continued for 6 hours. Every 10 minutes precisely, 3 knocks. We timed them, watching the clock, waiting for each set with growing dread. Sometimes Anton would open the door, sometimes I would. Once, Dmitri woke and checked himself, convinced we were playing some kind of elaborate prank. Each time, the same result. Nothing there, nothing visible, nothing that should have been capable of making those sounds. By morning, which was still pitch black but indicated by our watches as the time when activity should resume, we decided to set up surveillance. Dmitri rigged one of our cameras to face the door, recording continuously in high definition with infrared capability for the darkness. We would catch whatever was making those sounds. We would have evidence, explanation, something to make sense of what was happening. The knocking continued throughout the day. Every 10 minutes, 3 knocks. The camera recorded all of it. We watched in real time on a monitor in the main room, waiting to see whatever figure would appear to make those sounds. No one ever appeared. The footage showed our door, the frame, the snow swirling past the threshold. At precise 10-minute intervals, we could see the door shake slightly, responding to impacts that clearly came from something solid, but there was no hand making those impacts. No figure standing at our entrance. The knocks came from empty air, from the darkness itself, from something that existed just beyond what our camera could perceive. 14 hours of footage, 84 sets of knocks, nothing visible on any frame. Katya suggested reviewing the audio separately, isolating it from the visual component to analyze more carefully. She had software on her laptop for weather sound analysis, capable of filtering and enhancing audio frequencies. We transferred the footage and let her work, while the rest of us sat in uncomfortable silence, listening to the endless knocking that continued even as we analyzed it. What she found made my blood run cold in ways the Siberian winter never could. Behind the knocking, almost completely buried in the howl of the blizzard, was another sound. Breathing, heavy, wet breathing, like a large animal panting after exertion, or a person breathing through a mouth filled with fluid. The breathing was continuous between knocks, never pausing, never changing rhythm, as if whatever was making it needed no rest. And beneath the breathing, barely audible, even with Katya's enhancement software, was a voice, whispering in Russian, repeating the same phrase over and over in a tone that made every hair on my body stand rigid. Thank you for answering. Now I know you're home. We left that night. We didn't discuss it. We didn't debate. We simply began packing, each of us moving with frantic efficiency, abandoning equipment that had taken 2 years to assemble because nothing was worth staying another hour in that cabin. The knocking continued as we loaded the snowmobiles, 3 solid impacts every 10 minutes, patient and precise, as if whatever was making them knew we weren't leaving fast enough to matter. The journey back to civilization was a nightmare of darkness and cold and terror. We drove through the night and the following day, stopping only to refuel, pushing ourselves to the edge of collapse to put distance between us and that cabin. By the time we reached Yakutsk, we were half frozen, exhausted, and unable to explain to ourselves what we had experienced. I contacted the cabin owner a week later, after I had returned to Moscow and attempted to resume something resembling normal life. I told him about the knocking, about the breathing, about the whispered voice on our recordings. I expected him to dismiss my account as hallucination or exaggeration. Instead, he went very quiet. He told me that the previous renters had experienced the same thing. A research team from Japan, studying permafrost samples, who had cut their trip short after 10 days and refused to explain why. Before them, a documentary crew who had left after only a week, leaving behind expensive equipment in their haste to escape. And before them, 2 years ago, a group of 4 Russian hikers who had rented the cabin for a winter expedition. They had stayed until day 15. On day 15, according to the owner, they had opened the door one final time. Perhaps they had grown accustomed to the knocking. Perhaps they had decided to confront whatever was making it. Perhaps they had simply made a mistake, their judgment compromised by 2 weeks of isolation and unexplainable phenomena. Their bodies were found a week later, 40 kilometers from the cabin, scattered across the tundra in a pattern that suggested they had been running. All 4 were frozen solid, their faces twisted into expressions of absolute terror, their mouths open in screams that no one had been alive to hear. The cause of death was officially hypothermia. The official explanation was that they had become disoriented in a storm and died of exposure. But the owner told me something the official reports hadn't mentioned, something the investigators had chosen not to include in their documentation. The bodies had been found with their backs to the cabin, all 4 of them, facing away, as if they had been fleeing from something that had come out of that door, something that had chased them across 40 kilometers of frozen darkness. And on each of their backs, pressed into the frozen fabric of their jackets, was a handprint, too large to be human, too long in the fingers, pressed so deep it had left marks on the skin beneath. I never returned to that cabin. None of us did. Anton abandoned his astrophotography hobby entirely. Dmitri moved to Spain, as far from Siberian winters as he could get. Katya refused to discuss what we had experienced and eventually stopped responding to my messages altogether. I still have the audio file Katya extracted from our footage. The breathing, the whispered voice. Thank you for answering. Now I know you're home. I tell myself I keep it as evidence, as documentation of something that needs to be remembered. But sometimes, late at night, I play it just to remind myself it was real. And sometimes when I do, I hear something new in the background, something that wasn't there in the original recording. A sound like knocking, 3 solid impacts, patient and precise. As if whatever was at that cabin door in Yakutia has learned where I live now. As if it knows I'm home. Story 10. I took the posting at Kotelny Island because I needed to escape from everything my life had become. A failed marriage, a career that had stalled at a mid-level position in the Moscow Meteorological Service, and a growing sense that I was watching my best years disappear into the gray monotony of bureaucratic work. The new Siberian islands offered something different. 90 days of solitude during the polar night, collecting weather data that fed into climate models no one would read, earning hazard pay that would let me start over when I returned. My predecessor was a grizzled veteran named Volkov, who had completed dozens of these rotations without incident. When I arrived in late October to take over the station, he spent 3 days walking me through the equipment, the protocols, the peculiarities of the isolated outpost. He was a man of few words, but on my last evening together, he opened a bottle of vodka and told me what to expect from the polar night. Peaceful, he called it. That was the word he used. Just you and the data and the quiet. The darkness wasn't oppressive, he insisted, but liberating. Without the cycle of day and night to structure your time, You could lose yourself in the work, in the rhythm of measurements and recordings that connected you to the larger world of science. He had grown to love the polar night, he said. It was the only place where he felt truly himself. He was wrong about everything. The station was small but well-equipped, a cluster of prefabricated buildings on the northern coast of Kotelny Island, overlooking the Arctic Ocean. I had a living quarters with a bunk and small kitchen, a separate building housing the meteorological instruments, and a communications center that linked me to the mainland via satellite. A generator provided electricity. A fuel depot held enough diesel to last 6 months. Supplies were delivered by helicopter once a month, weather permitting, and otherwise I was completely alone. The polar night began in early November, the sun dipping below the horizon and refusing to return until late January. I watched its final descent from the observation deck, a sliver of orange light that clung to the southern sky for perhaps 20 minutes before disappearing entirely. Then darkness closed over the islands like a lid, and I was alone with nothing but my instruments and the endless Arctic night. The first 2 months passed, much as Volkov had described. I fell into routines, collecting data at regular intervals, transmitting reports to the mainland, maintaining equipment against the brutal cold. The darkness was complete but not oppressive. I had expected to feel isolated, cut off, but instead I found a strange peace in the solitude. The stars were brilliant in the absence of light pollution, and I spent hours on the observation deck, wrapped in thermal gear, watching the aurora paint the sky in greens and purples. I marked the days carefully, counting down toward the moment when the sun would finally return. According to my astronomical tables, the first sunrise of the year would occur on January 24th, a brief appearance lasting perhaps 30 minutes before the sun slipped back below the horizon. It would be a symbolic moment, the first light after nearly 3 months of darkness, proof that the world still turned and spring would eventually return. Day 73 was January 24th. I woke early by my internal clock, showered and ate a careful breakfast, then bundled myself in every layer of thermal gear I possessed. I climbed to the observation deck and faced south, toward the horizon where the sun should have been rising. The sky remained black. I checked my watch. I checked my astronomical tables. I checked the calculations that told me exactly where and when the sun should appear. Everything confirmed what I already knew. At this latitude, on this date, at this precise time, the sun should have been visible above the southern horizon for the first time in 73 days. But there was nothing, only darkness, absolute and unchanging. I told myself it was clouds, an unusually thick layer obscuring the brief sunrise, blocking the light before it could reach my eyes. I returned to my instruments and checked the weather data. The sky was clear, visibility was unlimited. There were no clouds, no atmospheric interference, nothing that should have prevented me from seeing the sun. I radioed the mainland to report the discrepancy. The operator in Tixi seemed confused by my concern. The sun had risen on schedule everywhere else, he said. Satellite imagery showed normal conditions across the entire Arctic. He asked if my instruments might be malfunctioning, if perhaps the polar night had affected my perception of time. I insisted I was fine. I knew what day it was. I knew what time it was. I knew the sun should have risen, and I was telling him it hadn't. He suggested I rest and contact them again the following day. The following day, the sun should have been visible for nearly an hour. It wasn't. The sky remained as black as it had been in the depths of November. I stood on the observation deck for the entire predicted window, scanning the horizon, desperate for any glimmer of light. Nothing. I radioed the mainland again. This time, I reached a supervisor who took my report more seriously. He checked with other stations in the region. He confirmed that the sun had risen normally at every location within 1,000 kilometers of my position. He told me that satellite imagery showed the new Siberian islands receiving normal sunlight consistent with the season. But I was standing outside, looking at nothing but black sky. For 17 additional days, I remained in complete darkness while the rest of the region transitioned to normal day cycles. Each morning, I climbed to the observation deck and watched for a sunrise that never came. Each evening, I radioed the mainland with increasingly desperate reports that they increasingly dismissed as psychological effects of extended isolation. They stopped believing me around day 80. The supervisor who had initially taken my concerns seriously was replaced by a psychologist who asked gentle questions about my mental state, about whether I was sleeping well, about whether I had been experiencing any unusual thoughts or perceptions. I understood what was happening. They had decided I was crazy, that the polar night had broken something in my mind, that I was seeing darkness that existed only in my imagination. I stopped calling. Instead, I spent my remaining days documenting everything I could. I photographed the sky every hour, capturing frame after frame of absolute blackness, where there should have been Arctic daylight. I recorded my observations in meticulous detail, describing the unchanging darkness with clinical precision. If I was going to be dismissed as insane, I would at least leave a record that proved I had witnessed something real. On day 90, the relief helicopter was scheduled to arrive. I waited at the landing pad, my equipment packed, my documentation prepared, watching the southern sky for any sign of the approaching aircraft. I had been told the helicopter would arrive at 1,400 hours, local time, which should have been broad Arctic daylight by normal calculations. Instead, I stood in darkness so complete that I could barely see my own hands. Then I heard the rotors. The helicopter appeared as a cluster of lights in the blackness, navigation beacons, and a searchlight cutting through the polar void. It approached the island quickly, then slowed, hovering perhaps 100 meters from the landing pad. The searchlight swept across the ground, across the station buildings, across me standing alone in the darkness. It landed, and the pilot emerged with an expression I will never forget. He was shaking, not from cold, though the temperature was brutal. He was shaking with something closer to terror. He grabbed my arm and asked me what was happening, where the sun had gone, why his instruments had failed the moment he entered the island's airspace. I didn't understand at first. He explained in fragments, his voice trembling. He had departed from Tixi in normal daylight, Arctic spring sunshine illuminating the world below his aircraft. He had flown north over the ocean, watching the ice glitter in the sun. Then, approximately 50 kilometers from the islands, everything had changed. The sun had vanished, not set, not been obscured by clouds, simply ceased to exist, as if someone had thrown a switch. His instruments had gone dark, compass spinning, altimeter reading impossible numbers. Only his GPS had continued to function, guiding him toward coordinates that existed in a world without light. He had considered turning back. Every instinct had screamed at him to flee, to escape whatever impossibility had swallowed the islands. But he had a job to do, a man to extract, and he was enough of a professional to push through his terror. We loaded my equipment in frantic silence, neither of us willing to remain on that island a moment longer than necessary. The pilot's hands shook on the controls as we lifted off, the helicopter's lights carving a small bubble of visibility through the absolute darkness. Then, approximately 50 kilometers south of the islands, the sun returned. It was instantaneous. One moment, we were flying through polar night. The next, we were bathed in Arctic daylight, the sun hanging low in the southern sky, exactly where it should have been all along. I looked back toward the islands and saw the boundary clearly. A wall of darkness, a curtain of absolute black, stretching from horizon to horizon, as if something had drawn a line across the world and refused to let light pass. The pilot never flew that route again. He filed a report that was buried in some classified archive, dismissed as instrument malfunction or psychological episode. No one wanted to acknowledge what we had both witnessed. I was evacuated and reassigned to a desk position in Moscow. I never returned to the field. The experience had broken something in me that I couldn't repair, a fundamental faith in the orderliness of the universe that once lost could never be restored. But I couldn't let go entirely. To this day, I check satellite data for those coordinates obsessively. I have access to commercial imagery, to weather satellite feeds, to every publicly available source of information about the new Siberian islands. Most of the time, the images show exactly what they should: Arctic terrain, ice and rock, sunlight in summer, and darkness in winter. But sometimes, for just a few frames, the images show something else. Darkness where there should be light. A patch of absolute black over the islands, lasting for perhaps a second before the next frame returns to normal. As if something there is still refusing to let the sun in, as if the polar night I experienced has never truly ended. I tell myself it's a glitch in the satellite systems, a momentary error in image processing, a trick of light and shadow that creates the illusion of impossible darkness. But I know what I saw during those 17 days. I know the sun should have risen and didn't. I know something on those islands exists outside the normal rules of the physical world. And I know, with a certainty that haunts my dreams, that whatever keeps the light away is still there, waiting in a night that lasts forever, watching for anyone foolish enough to return.